We are up to Mishnah 5 of chapter 2. Until now, every Mishnah has been a new rabbi, a new scholar, a new sage. And this time we see Hillel, whom we met in chapter 1, and now we see him again in chapter 2 to tell us a collection of these very powerful lessons that we'll see. And he's actually going to give us Mishnah 6 and 7 and 8. So we have a lot of Hillel in our immediate future. We're going to read his teaching, and then we'll go through it bit by bit. He begins, Al tifrosh min hatzibor. Hillel says, do not separate yourself, do not depart from the tzibur, from the community. That's number 1. Number 2, Va'al ta'amin ba'atzmecha ad yom moscha. Don't believe in yourself, don't trust yourself until the day of your death. Va'al tadas chaverecha ad tariyel makomo, and do not judge your fellow until you have reached his place. Va'al tomar davar she'ef shalishmo shesofer li shomea. Do not say something that is not possible to understand immediately on the grounds that it will in the end be understood. And finally, Va'al tomar lekeshe'efne eshne, and do not say, quote, when I'm free I will study. Shema lo tipane, perhaps you won't become free. So thus we have 5 teachings from Hillel. Don't separate yourself from the community. Don't trust yourself until the day of your death. Don't judge your fellow until you arrive at his place. Don't say something that's somewhat obscure, that's hard to understand on the grounds that will be understood in the future. And finally, don't say, when I am free, I will study. I'm too busy now. But sometime in the future, I'll have plenty of time, and then I'll study. Because you know what? It's possible that future time will never arrive. So it begins with not separating yourself from the public. And all the commentaries, of course, give their own flavor of what this means and what the lessons are. So, simply put, when everyone's doing something good, join them. Obviously, this does not mean that when everyone's sinning, I should join with them as well. If I'm around by the golden calf, everyone's sinning. Rabbi, you told me that don't depart from the community. Of course, that's a proper place to depart from the community. What it means is, when everyone's doing a mitzvah, don't say, oh, I'm not joining. I'll do it later. Because there's a special power when a mitzvah is done with great numbers. There's a famous verse, Berov am hadras melach, with multitudes of the nation, that's a glory for the king. If you have one person doing a mitzvah, that's fantastic. If there's 10 people doing the mitzvah together, even better. 100,000, the larger the number, the greater the mitzvah. And now, there's, of course, one place where this is most applicable, and that's with prayer. There's, of course, prayer done individually, and there's prayer done collectively. And when a prayer is done collectively, it's much more powerful. It's much more potent. In fact, the Talmud tells us that just like on the high holidays, on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, prayer is that much more potent. God is, so to speak, closer to us. Our ability to affect change is heightened during those times. Similarly, even throughout the year, that same ideal applies when prayer is done publicly versus privately. And even if a person may say correctly that, well, when I pray privately, I can really open up my heart to God. I can really expose my innermost feelings, and the prayer is so much more powerful. Here we're told, no, don't depart from the community, from the public, even if your prayer individually is more powerful. The fact that you're going to compromise something praying publicly, but what you're going to gain is going to outweigh what you're going to give up. So that's the first idea, to do mitzvos with everyone else. Even if it means you're going to have to sacrifice some of your own tranquility, some of your own peace of mind, study publicly and pray publicly. There's a story in the Talmud about one of the sages who was ill. And due to his illness, he was unable to travel to shul to join the community when they prayed. But he sent a messenger, go to the shul and notify me when they're praying. Because I want to pray, even though I can't pray together with them, I want to pray at the same time as them. And thus, the halacha tells us that even if someone is unable to pray with the public, with the tzibur, with the community, it's ideal if they could pray, if they have to pray privately, at least they should pray at the same time that the prayer is being done publicly, because then, so to speak, they could piggyback their prayer on the prayer of the community. Now, the Chassid Yavitz said something, he gives a whole list of applications of this principle of participating with the public. And he says something interesting. He says, he gives a list, but amongst those lists, he says there's a repentance and charity, two examples that he brings. If the whole community is repenting, or the whole community is supporting a cause, every member, every individual of the community should participate. So if, let's say, there's a public arousal to repentance on whatever issue, then it should be, everyone should participate. Everyone should join in. I remember when I was in Israel, there was a member of our community. I didn't even really know him, but he lives in the same neighborhood, and he had brain cancer. So they made a convention. Everyone that got together in the shul. What do we do? What do we spiritually advocate for him, to that way maybe he should merit a full recovery? And the rabbi got up and gave a speech saying, well, if someone has cancer in their brain, that's a sign of something that's not supposed to be in the brain. And therefore, he said he exhorted the community, let's try to get rid of all the stuff that shouldn't be in our brain from our brain. That's just one example. But the idea is that if everyone's getting together and participating in an effort to repent in whatever area or to improve whatever area, everyone should say, I'm joining a board. I'm part of the community. In addition, if everyone's getting together to support a charity, everyone should participate. And then he says something very scary. He quotes a midrash that says that people who don't participate in communal efforts to do good in whatever arena that may be, that those people are sinners. Moreover, he says something very harsh. He says if someone does not participate in a communal effort to do good, when they die, their relatives shouldn't mourn them. Why? And this is, I'm quoting from, it's very scary, but he says they shouldn't mourn, they should feast. Because someone who doesn't participate when the community is doing something positive is an enemy of God. His words, not mine. And therefore, when they die, they should celebrate. Very, very harsh, biting criticism of someone who refrains from participating when the community does something good. That's what we read in the Midrash. Rashi gives a generalistic interpretation of this. He says that when everyone's suffering, suffer alongside them. When everyone's rejoicing, then rejoice alongside them as well. I would say perhaps we could give a practical example. Don't be the one who cracks jokes at funerals or the one who's somber at a comedy event. Like if everyone's happy, everyone's joyous, try to join the community. Don't be the renegade. Don't be the outlier. Don't be the one who says, I'm different. Don't be the contrarian just for contrarian's sake and saying, I'm not participating when everyone else is participating in it. There's another realm of this principle, and that is with respect to judgment, specifically divine judgment. We know that we're judged, of course, in this realm by humans. We can be judged by a court. We can be judged by a Jewish court. We can be judged by a secular court. We can be judged by our friends. We can be judged by our enemies. We can be judged by humans. But in addition, we're told that we're judged by God. In fact, on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, those are called the days of judgment, because we get judged by God. And we get judged collectively, we get judged individually. And if you look at the prayers and the liturgy and the philosophy of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and in addition, all the sages and the commentators throughout the history, they would always stress that our goal on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is to be judged as part of a community, not to be judged as individuals. Why? As individuals, we all have flaws. And we all have holes in our character, our behavior, our ideals, our priorities, our values. All of us, if we're scrutinized, you can find flaws with us. Just like kind of the IRS. They always get the mobsters on their tax, on their tax reporting, on tax evasion. Because everyone has something. If you look hard enough, you'll find something. You look hard enough, you'll find something that's not reported or whatever. Similarly, with respect to how God judges us, if he looks hard enough to us as individuals, we'll find something. However, there is a pledge by God that the Jewish nation will always emerge meritorious Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Which is why the Midrash tells us right after Yom Kippur is done, we take the lulav and the esrog, we take the branch and we shake it, we brandish it, says the Midrash. What's that like? It's like a victorious warrior returning from battle, brandishing the sword up high. Similarly, the Jewish people went to battle, and every Yom Kippur we know we're emerging victorious. Of course, to be part of the Jewish nation is sort of rocky. If you look at our history, chaotic, upheavals, dispersions, lots of mistreatment by our friends and with friends like this who needs enemies. But as a whole, we're still around despite the odds. Because the Jewish nation will always survive. And therefore, our objective or our focus on Yom Kippur should be, on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur should be, how do I join the nation? How do I make sure that I earn the acquittal that's going to be given to the nation? I have to become part of the nation. Now, there's a mind-blowing teaching in the Talmud that if you just read it, it's totally inexplicable. It doesn't make any sense. But in this light, it makes a whole abundance of sense. The Talmud tells us in the end of the book of Yoma, Yoma is the book that deals with Yom Kippur. It says something that appears completely odd. If a man sees a seminal emission on Yom Kippur, he will die that year. But if he doesn't, he should know that he's completely righteous. That's what the Talmud tells us. Seems very odd, very strange. And my grandfather explained it beautifully. We know that in Yom Kippur, there's 5 prohibitions of pleasures that we're not allowed to partake in. Eating, drinking, washing, smearing ourselves with oils. And one of them is to not engage in marital intimacy. It's to refrain from carnal pleasure. Well, someone who sees a seminal mission Yom Kippur is someone who is not participating in what the whole community is suffering. The whole community is withholding from pleasure. And this person is saying, you know what? I'm not withholding from pleasure. Therefore, they are excluding themselves from the community, from the public. And therefore, because they're not participating in the suffering, so to speak, in the affliction that the community is partaking in, therefore they're judged as individuals. And therefore they're going to die that year, because most individuals can't withstand the scrutiny of being judged alone. But however, if they don't die that year, they should know that they're completely righteous, because they were able to withstand the scrutiny as an individual. A fascinating explanation from my grandfather of this Talmud, and this ideal that we want to be part of the community because it saves us from being judged as individuals, and it'll ensure that we are acquitted in judgment. What's the next teaching of the Mishnah? The next teaching of the Mishnah is don't believe in yourself until the day you die. So the Rambam connects these two teachings together. Don't depart from the public, and don't believe in yourself until the day you die. Says the Rambam, what does this mean? If the whole community is studying, and what do you say? You say, I got this. I'm an expert at this. I don't need to study with them. I've mastered this topic or this skill. Everyone's studying the laws of Shabbos. I study the laws of Shabbos very intensively. I know them. I don't need to partake in it. Says the Rambam, don't believe. What does the next teaching of the Mishnah say? Don't believe yourself until the day you die. You have to realize that there's a certain fallibility that we have as humans. We can't be sure that whatever status we've attained, we will retain it forever. And therefore, join the community when they're doing something. Don't say that, you've mastered it, because how could you be sure that you won't lose it? So that's the general idea, is that don't trust in yourself, because whatever you have today, whatever you've achieved, you may lose it. And therefore, until you're dead, you can't be guaranteed that you're not going to lose it. This idea, just very, very powerful, very scary, that we can't be certain in whatever status we have. We don't know for sure that whatever we have, we won't lose. And the reason for that is, of course, is that we have a Yetzer Hara. We have an evil inclination. And the evil inclination is relentless. It is unyielding. It doesn't give up. There's a fascinating midrash in Psalms, Midrash Tehillim, on Psalm 34. The midrash gives us an illustration of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, and its relentlessness. It contrasts it. You meet someone for an hour. What happens when two humans meet and they get to know each other? Almost invariably, they'll become friends. That's just the nature of human interaction. If they meet each other, they spend some time together, they'll become friendly. That's humans. What about the evil inclination? Evil inclination, we're told in the Talmud, has been with us since we were born. Since the day that we arrived into this planet, we've had a Yetzer Hara. So we've been in companionship with the Yetzer Hara our whole lives. And does he love us? Is he friendly with us? Absolutely not. Says the Midrash, he's always scheming for ways to make us falter, to make us suffer, to make us have miscues, to make us have missteps. And if he doesn't succeed at the time we're 20, he'll continue until the time we're 40. And if he doesn't succeed when we're 40, he'll continue to try till we're 70 or even 80. Concludes the Midrash, is there any enemy that we have in our lives as tenacious, as relentless as this one? We could win over the Yetzer Hara 150 times. Does he throw up the white flag of surrender and give up? Never. And therefore, how can we trust in ourselves until the day we die? If you trust in yourself before you're out of the arena, before your Yetzer Hara is removed from you, you're essentially allowing the Yetzer Hara to overcome you. Because the second you get complacent, the second you rest on your laurels, the second you allow the Yetzer Hara to come at you, and you're not resisting or combating his efforts, well, you're probably going to lose, because he's still there, and he doesn't give up until the day you die, and therefore you can't give up until the day you die either. Now, all the commentaries bring an episode of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was a great rabbi and a great sage, and a Kohen who spent 80 years as the Kohen Gadol, as the high priest. And towards the end of his life, he became a heretic. He became a Sadducee. And therefore, he's always the prime example of someone who could be at the peak of the spiritual world, the spiritual leader of the nation, the righteous, pious leader of the Jewish people, and at the end of his life, before he died, falter and become a heretic and lose everything that he had accomplished. Just as an aside, how did this happen? How did the great high priest become a heretic? And the answer is because he wanted to help the heretics. He said, I'm going to reach out to them. I'm going to befriend them so that I can influence them. But what actually happened is that they influenced him and he didn't influence them, which shows us again the perils of exposing yourself to danger and willfully encountering evil and saying, oh, I know I'm secure, I won't succumb. He trusted himself a little bit before he died, and his trust was misplaced. There's a statement that we say that life is like running up a descending escalator. The default is that you're going to regress, you're going to descend, you're going to lose your spiritual acuity, your spiritual power, your spiritual purity. But if you work hard, if you resist, then you'll stay in the same place. You won't drop. You have to work really, really, really hard to ascend to higher levels. But just to maintain your status, you have to work. The second someone trusts in themselves, then they start to fall down and regress. So that's the first idea here, is that we can't trust ourselves because we always have the specter of the Yetzer Hara looming above us. And if we don't have the mindset of resistance and overcoming, we're going to start regressing. That's number one. There's another idea here. It's couched in a terrifying and inspiring story that with one decision, we could really it really have lifelong consequences. It's not necessarily that it takes 1,000 decisions to affect what happens to someone's life. With even one decision, we could really kill the potential greatness that's latent within us. And this is what I heard from my grandfather. He writes in one of his books, a teaching or a story that he heard from Rabbi Yechaskel Sarna, who was the head of the yeshiva in Hebron. Hebron is one of the biggest yeshivas in the world, maybe the third or fourth biggest yeshiva in the world in Jerusalem. And he said, this great rabbi, this great head of the yeshiva, that when he was young, he heard a Musar talk, a Musar vad, from one of the heads of the Musar movement in that time. And his whole life, this idea was ringing in his ears. It was buzzing within him. One of the giants of the generation, one of the greatest Torah sages of the generation, got married very young. And he married the daughter of a man who had a flour mill. That's what was his business. He had a flour mill, grinding wheat to turn it into flour. And after he got married, he was studying Torah with great diligence and assiduousness. And one time, his father-in-law needed some help in the flour mill. And he said, you know what? I'm going to hire my prodigious son-in-law to work with me in the flour mill. The son-in-law is studying Torah, like with incredible diligence, and he refuses the job. I'm not interested. I'm going to continue studying. And the Musar Vad went on to say, well, let's see what would have happened to this individual had he accepted the job, had he yielded to his father-in-law's request. Well, he would have joined the flour mill, and that would have been his job, and he would have taken over for his father-in-law, and that would have been his business. Certainly, he would study Torah every day, of course. He wouldn't, he would still be religious, etc., but he wouldn't have become a great Torah giant. And what would have happened after he died? He would get up to heaven, and he gets there for the accounting and the reckoning before God. And he comes up there, and he lived a good life, had a nice family. The flour mill was successful. He also studied Torah a little bit. Seems like he's ready to go. He gets up before God, and God says to him, you killed the giant of the generation. You killed the greatest Torah sage of the generation. And the guy's going to say, what? I didn't kill anyone. I can't even kill a fly. How could you possibly accuse me of this horrific crime? And they would tell him, they would say, no, you killed the greatest Torah sage of the generation. Why? Because you remember once when you were a teenager, you were a young boy, you studied with great potential, and then you became a flour mill operator. But had you continued studying, you would have reached the absolute pinnacle of Torah greatness. And because you accepted this job, you effectively killed that great Torah sage. It doesn't exist because of your inaction. That was the content of this Vad, of this Musar lesson that this Rosh Hashiva had heard. The lesson is that we don't know necessarily the impact of our actions. And it's possible with one action that sets us on a certain course that we're going to follow for the rest of our lives. And therefore we're told here to have uncertainty. Don't believe in yourself. Because who knows? If you're so confident in your decision, it's possible you're making a grievous mistake. You don't even realize it at the time. But in hindsight, or certainly in God's purview, He sees everything and all possible angles of every decision and all possible permutations of those decisions. And therefore, your decision that you think is somewhat innocuous. Listen, could you blame someone for getting an honest living? Of course you can't. And we can't make that judgment. But God can. Our perspective and God's perspective are different. And I think that's exactly what the Mishnah is telling us. Don't believe in yourself till the day you die, because who knows how God sees it. Maybe God sees it very differently than you do. There is a similar story to this that is, I think it's a more famous one. It's told about the Netziv. The Netziv, Rabbi Netziv is an acronym for Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was one of the most influential rabbis of the 19th century, 1817 to 1893. He was the head of the yeshiva in Volozhin. Volozhin is considered the mother of all yeshivos, and he was the head of the Rosh Yeshiva for 50 years. And he also was the author of many great Torah books, the first of which, maybe his most famous one, or maybe his most influential one, is what's called the Hamek Shaila. The Hamek Shaila. Hamek Shaila is a commentary on the She'iltos de Rabbi Chai Gaon. She'iltos de Rabbi Chai Gaon is one of the first Torah books written after the Talmud. After the era of the Talmud concluded, there was basically a lull in Torah writing for hundreds of years. But Rav Achai Gaon, one of the Gaonim, one of the heads of the yeshiva in Sur and Pumbedisa in Babylon, he wrote a book called She'iltos. She'iltos is the word for questions. And essentially it's broken down into the parshas of the Torah. And it's a question on each parsha with a whole essay which gives a flavor of the parsha with some halachos. It's a book, one of the first books written after the Talmud. And in the 19th century, this Rosh Yeshiva, the Netziv, he wrote a commentary on the She'iltos of Rabbi Chai Gaon called the Hamek Shaila. And to celebrate this publication, he made a feast, as is sometimes customary. And by this feast, he gave a talk. And he said in this talk a story that happened to him. He said when he was a young child, he was 11 or 12 years old, he was not very successful in his Torah studies. He was obviously a very precocious young mind and very able, but he was interested in other things. He didn't want to study so much. And, of course, at the time, it was customary, if a child doesn't succeed in their Torah learning, at a very young age, they would send them to work in whatever field they can make a living. But it was quite customary for children 12, 13 years old, they're done with studies, and they go work. And he overheard his parents discussing what to do with this young child who doesn't want to study Torah. Obviously, he doesn't have a career in Torah ahead of him. Let's set him up as an apprentice for the local shoemaker. Let him have a decent living as a shoemaker. And he's listening in to his parents talking about him. And he gets very emotional about it. And he goes over to his parents and says, give me one more chance. Let me prove my worth. And eventually he marries into one of the great rabbinical families, and he eventually heads the greatest yeshiva of the time. For 50 years, he has tens of thousands of students. All of the great young rabbis of the 19th and early 20th century are his disciples. And he wrote not only the Hamek Shaila on the She'iltos, but the Hamek Davar, other books, and he became a great genius and great Torah sage. But he says to them, he says during this speech, during this publication celebration, he says, well, what would have happened had I not been inspired by this episode and I became a shoemaker? Well, as the previous story says, I would have gone, this is him talking about himself, I would have gone up to heaven after I die. And I'd be interviewed by God, debriefed by God. And they say, okay, what are your accomplishments? You lived life. God gave you life. What you accomplish? What do you have to show for yourself? And they'll show like this amazing shoe, very well built, and a nice, it's built with very rugged leather, and look how stylish it is, and this kind of shoe and that kind of shoe. And they'll say to them, well, where's your Hamek Shaila? He says, what's a Hamek Shaila? I have no idea what that is. Well, it's a commentary on the She'iltos Rabbi Chai Gaon. He'll say to him, I don't know what's the She'iltos and who is Rabbi Chai Gaon. That's his story. And he says that this one episode inspired him, and otherwise who knows what would have happened to him, because God demands from a person what they could have accomplished given the skills and the abilities that they and the circumstances of their lives, and therefore he's kind of inspiring the listeners and us today, 150 years later, when we're talking about this story, inspiring us to try to maximize what we can achieve with whatever God gave us and not sell ourselves short and not arrive to God with just shoes when we could have written publications on Torah. That, of course, is very terrifying for us because we're not existing post facto, and we're very uncertain. Did we make the right decisions in our lives? And that's what we're told in this Mishnah. Don't believe in yourself till the day you die, because who knows how much one choice, one decision could really be a pivotal juncture in your life, and you don't even know about it. I think there's also a positive element to this. The Talmud tells us that if someone is wicked their whole lives, but the day before they die, they repent, and therefore they die in repentance. Says the Talmud, when that person gets before God, they are not reminded of any of their previous misdeeds, which I think is a positive spin on this. We shouldn't be confident until the day we die, but we shouldn't be despondent until the day we die either, because so long as we're alive, so long as we have opportunity, we still could achieve whatever greatness that is still possible. Of course, once you're dead, that's it. The opportunities are over. But until today that you're dying, don't be confident that you made the right decisions, but don't be despondent that you made the wrong ones, because you still have time to rectify whatever it is. So I think that's the flip side of it. That gives us always an opportunity, so long as we're alive, to make sure that we make the best out of our situation from here henceforth until we die, and we can achieve our greatness yet. This great Rabbi Yochanan, who was the high priest, he was the spiritual leader of the people. But you know what? At the end, he floundered. And it could be the opposite. There's many stories in the Talmud where it tells about people who lived lives of sin, people who were evil, people who were murderers, people who were so immersed in promiscuity. And the day that they died, they turned it all around. And they were granted a spiritual lease on life because they ended on the positive note. They ended with repentance. Until we leave this world, our story has not yet been cemented. Our legacy has not yet been cemented. Don't believe in yourself until the day you die, but don't give up on yourself until the day you die either. So that is some of the lessons of the second clause of the Mishnah. Don't believe in yourself until the day that you die. The third thing is, don't judge your fellow until you arrive in his place. As we're told, there's a famous idiom, don't judge another person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And the idea here is it's all very much connected to the previous teachings. So you may have, for example, we're told to participate in public activities that are positive. Don't depart from the community. Well, sometimes you look at the community and say, well, this guy, this gal, so-and-so, not for me. I don't want to join the community. What's that line? I don't want to be part of any club that is okay having me as a member. There's that famous line. I don't want to be part of a club that has this and this person as a member. And therefore, if everyone's praying, but this guy's there, or if everyone's repenting, that guy's there, I'm out. Therefore, we're told here, don't judge them. And that will enable you to fully embrace what the public is doing that is positive. And we know, of course, Hillel was the one who enshrined what's known as the golden rule. Do not unto others what you don't want to be done unto you. When the prospective convert came to Hillel, says, teach me all of Torah while I'm balancing on one leg. Hillel said to him, this is the one core idea of Torah. Everything else is commentary. Go study it. What's that one thing? Love your fellow as yourself. So this is a very similar idea that we're told, don't judge someone else until you're in that same situation. We just treat them as yourself. Just like you afford yourself allowances and you have justification for your own behavior and you provide yourself a certain allowance of goodwill, treat him with the same way. Just like you love yourself, love him. Just like you judge yourself favorably, judge him favorably. Don't judge him until you try to think, what would I do in his shoes? Just a few examples of how this could play out. It's always try to superimpose yourself into someone else's situation. So if someone did something bad to you, there's an escalating tension between you and someone else, and you want to judge them for their behavior, ask yourself, well, how would you act if you did to him? Or if he did to you what you did to him, what would you do to him? And that way, you look at what he did to you and say, well, maybe I would do the exact same thing. If he did to me what I did to him, I'd do to him what he did to me. Which is a little bit of a tongue twister, but it means try to ask yourself, what would I do in his situation? And on the flip side, ask yourself, how would I feel if I was about to be the victim of what I'm about to do to him? And if you think of yourself in terms of what it's like, what the other person's going through, try to see the world from their perspective and try to judge them as if you were judging yourself. Of course, just like you judge yourself favorably in most instances, and it's very hard, in fact, to admit that you were wrong. Try to give that same allowance to your fellow, and you'll probably judge them favorably too. And similarly, this, of course, extends to criticism. It's very easy for us to critique others and to rebuke them for their behavior, but that should be done without, if it's done at all, it should be done with this in mind, that maybe if I was in their situation, I'd be even worse, and not judging them until I think about what all the circumstances of their lives. And of course, by extension of that, it's not possible for me to know exactly what they're going through. And that, of course, makes my judgment of them necessarily incomplete. Some of the commentaries bring the story of Yeravam ben Nevat and King Solomon. King Solomon was the king of Israel after his father, King David, and he built the temple. But the Midrash tells us that he had many, many wives. In fact, we're told that Solomon had 1,000 wives. Quite a harem to manage. But the reason why he had so many wives was because he wanted to build alliances with all these other kingdoms in his vicinity. And one of the wives wanted to sabotage the newly built temple. And we know in the temple you have to bring sacrifices every morning. And there's a fixed amount of time that you have to bring sacrifices. And what this woman did, she wanted to have Solomon sleep in. And then he'll miss bringing the sacrifice. So what did she do? She did some sort of contraption that made it look like it was still nighttime. And therefore he slept in, and they missed one day of sacrifices. So Yeravam ben Nevat, Jeroboam, who was going to lead the secession against Solomon's successor, he got up and he lambasted Solomon for missing one day of sacrifices. And then the commentaries bring, well, what happened with Yeravam ben Nevat? He was the one who severed the 10 northern tribes from the temple. And thus, how many thousands of sacrifices did he disrupt? Yet he's willing to judge Solomon for missing out on only one sacrifice, which is again the irony. Don't judge others, because who knows how much worse you may be. Finally, don't say something that's somewhat obscure with the intention, with the understanding, with the hope that it will be understood in the future. So what this actually means, all the commentaries have a slightly different take on it. Rashi, for example, says, don't postpone or delay or push off studying, saying you'll study later, which is very similar to the last clause of the Mishnah. Rashi also, and other commentators as well, they present this idea with respect to secrets. Don't say something and say no one will hear it, because someone in the end will hear it. And interestingly, this idiom that we say that the walls have ears, that is brought down by the commentaries that are 1,000 years old. Say the exact same words. Oznayim la kasalim. There's ears to the walls. If you say a secret and you say no one will hear it, in the end, someone will hear it. And the Rambam, it looks like the Art Scroll commentary, the Art Scroll translation goes with the Rambam, who is giving us a lesson to not shroud our statements and our teachings with so much obscurity. Don't say something, I'll say it with such nuance. In the end, they'll get it, because you know what? Maybe they won't get it in the end. And finally, the last clause of the Mishnah, don't say, when I become free, I'll study. Maybe I won't become free. And this is, of course, Simply understood, don't say, oh, in the future, after college, after my job, after my schooling, after I finish the game, after, then I'll study, then I'll do what's right, because you know what, that time may never happen. There's no time like the present to accomplish whatever it is that we're brought here to do. So that concludes a magnificent, amazing teaching from Hillel. Some of these lessons, of course, are a little bit scary. Some of them refer to our death. Don't believe in yourself to the day that you die. Don't say, I'll study before I die, because who knows when that will happen. Don't separate yourself from the community. Don't judge your fellow until you have his place. And following these lessons, they, of course, if we do follow these lessons, we'll be able to live much richer spiritual lives, which is, of course, what we are here to do.